Happy Earth Day, everyone. I hope you're celebrating this amazing day. I know it's one of my favorite holidays, and I hope you're going to enjoy this amazing Earth Day interview. I'm here with the author, David Wallace-Wells, and he just came out with his amazing and frightening book, The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. And I gotta say, read the book. It's pretty intense. I like to keep it light. You go a little dark.
It's bleak out there.
It's bleak out there, but I want to just start off with asking you, what inspired you to write this book and get all this information down?
I was just seeing, I'm a journalist, I'm mostly a magazine journalist, and I was seeing a lot of reports, academic research and commentary from scientists that just was so divergent from the way that climate change was being talked about in newspapers and on TV. This was back in 2015, 2016. And I thought there was this huge gap in coverage, which was that the issue was much more serious than we were sort of led to believe. It was happening a lot faster than we had been led to believe.
Right.
You know, it was going to be everywhere. It was not something you could escape just by living off the coast. And you know, we heard about this level of warming, 2 degrees, which scientists called the threshold of catastrophe. And we imagined that that was basically the worst it was going to get. But actually, it's something more like a best-case scenario, not a worst-case scenario. And so I saw this whole really epic story that climate change was not something we could compartmentalize or deal with in a kind of small-scale way. It was really going to be all-encompassing and affect everything about the way that we live on the planet in the century ahead. And I didn't see anybody telling that story. So I thought, let me do it. And the best way to do it is really just to collect all of that research. So, you know, the book is bleak, it's quite dark, but really that's a reflection of what the best science we have says. You know, it's not me that's layering on.
Making it worse.
Yeah, it's just
the reality.
the science is really terrifying.
And will you lay out for people who are not familiar with your book, what are some of these bleak outcomes that we could be facing or are on the path to facing at this point?
So right now we're at about 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming against what's called the pre-industrial average, which is basically before we started burning fossil fuels. We're at 1.1 degrees warmer than that. At about 2 degrees of warming, many of the biggest cities in the Middle East and South Asia will be unlivably hot in summer, so you won't be able to go outside in summer without risking heat stroke or even possibly death. That means that there will be a climate refugee crisis. The UN estimates as big as 200 million climate refugees. This is probably going to happen about 2050. They say it's possible we could have as many as 1 billion climate refugees by 2050. Wow. That's as many people as today live in North and South America combined. But we're on track for about 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century, so twice that. And that would mean a global GDP that's at least 20% and possibly 30% smaller than it would be without climate change. 30% would be an impact that's twice as deep as the Great Depression, and it would be permanent. There would be parts of the planet that could be hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. We would have agricultural yields that were only half as bountiful as they are today, and we'd be using them to feed probably 50% more people. And really everywhere you look, there's some kind of impact, even in places that are not intuitive. So there's a relationship between temperature and conflict. If we get to the end of the century, we're at this 4-degree threshold, that means that we'll have more than twice as much war as we have today. And that relationship actually holds not just between states, but also between individuals. So rates of murder would be higher, rates of rape would be higher. There's almost nothing in the modern world that is untouched by climate, and that's, I think, one of the main messages of my book, that it's really everywhere. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I've lived my whole life in a city, and I used to think that I lived outside of nature. But the deeper I get in the research, the more I realize that it sounds naive to say, we all live within nature, and when nature changes, it changes us back.
That's so interesting, because I feel that so much now that I work in sustainability, and I feel so much more connected to nature, and it makes me feel good, but at the same time, what you're saying is it's kind of backlashing against our actions. But I have a question. So why in this book did you really focus on, like, you go into like politics and immigration and economy collapse, and I feel like I haven't really seen that before. It's been a lot about the science, and why did you feel you had to do that personal, cultural observation and prediction?
Well, it's partly just because of my background. I mean, I write about science sometimes, but I'm not a science person. I'm a humanities person. And when I started doing this research, I wasn't just horrified at how big the impacts would be and how much worse it could get than we were really being led to believe. I also saw that that would totally transform everything about the way that we live. This isn't just about how much the sea level is going to rise. It's what will our global politics be like if we have 1 billion climate refugees? Could we possibly have a system like the one we have today enduring in an undisturbed way if there are 1 billion climate refugees around? And I think probably the answer is not. Or if we get to a place by the end of the century where whole parts of the planet have no hope of economic growth at all, what will that mean for our culture that's so oriented around the dream of economic growth and the hope of economic growth? And I think that these are really, really big questions that nobody had started to even ask before, let alone answer. And I think ultimately those impacts are going to be just as profound as the sort of narrowly scientific impacts.
And in the book, I was really surprised that you said you were still optimistic. And I want to ask you that because my show is very optimistic and I focus on the solutions almost to the point that maybe I should be getting a little bit more real about it because it's so real and I don't want to pretend I'm glossing everything over. But you have really gone through the darkness of everything and you're still saying you're an optimist. So why?
To me, it's all a matter of perspective.
Okay.
So if what you're basing if your baseline of expectation is the world as it is today, there's really no way that we're going to be able to stabilize the climate at anything like its current level.
Got it.
We're going to have some significant more warming, mostly because our politics and our infrastructure projects and all the things we need to do to reduce our carbon levels. All of those take time, and we're way behind right now. But if you base your expectations on where we're headed, that's 4 degrees by the end of the century, I think we'll do dramatically better than that. I think through renewable innovation, let's hope.
Prayers, literally.
But I think this is a big problem with climate generally, which is that every day we look out our windows, we think, oh, the world can't possibly be going to shit. Sorry.
It's fine. We'll bleep it out.
The world can't possibly be going to hell. It looks fine. It looks quite like the world that I grew up in. And the more that we anchor our expectations in the way that the world looks today, the less seriously we're taking these scientific projections about what's coming. And I think in order to take the kind of action that we need to really put into place, kind of radical changes to the way that we live, all of us together on this planet, requires us to take much more seriously these projections than most of us do. And I say that as someone who, I also live in compartmentalization. I don't spend my entire day thinking about the climate apocalypse, but that's to me a sign that I'm somebody who spent several years working in this material, and I still don't think about it all that much. That's to me a sign of just how deep our psychological and emotional biases are. We don't want to think about really bad scenarios, really bad outcomes, and so we choose not to. To me, that's an argument that we must focus on the science as much as we can, because if we don't, we're just going to walk blithely into a future that has a lot of suffering in store for us.
Yeah, totally. I know. I was asking some of my Instagram followers what their questions for you were, and one person goes, I can't even read the book. I have too much eco-depression. And I think everybody has a lot of eco-anxiety. And was there anything in your research that made you feel more hopeful and get rid of that anxiety? Like you said, renewable energy, you talk about like energy efficiency. Like what are some of the low-hanging fruit that we could, you think, really tackle in the next few years to like actually bring the warming down, prevent it?
Already renewable energy is cheaper in most parts of the world than dirty energy, which is a huge gain, and something that nobody predicted even just a decade ago. That's enormous.
That's great.
Of course, energy is only like a quarter of global emissions, so we have to deal with agriculture, we have to deal with infrastructure, industry, all these other sectors. But the thing that I'm most excited about is that I think our policy has been really slow for a long time because economists thought it was going to be really expensive to take action on climate, that it would mean massive upfront investment and it would mean foregoing some amount of economic growth because you'd want to close down a coal plant that was still workable, for instance. But there's been a huge sea change in the way that economists think about this issue.
That's great.
And now everybody really does believe that we'll all be better off economically in relatively short order if we take faster action rather than slower action. So one really exciting plan just came out a few weeks ago from the government of Indonesia. And this is a country that over the last 2 decades has doubled their per capita income. It's halved its poverty rate. But it's done that by industrializing, so it's doubled their carbon emissions. But they said that just by 2030, they could halve their carbon emissions, which means they'd be ahead of their commitments under the Paris Accords, and they could still grow at 6% per year, which is actually faster than the 5% per year they were growing over that period when they doubled their per capita income.
Because they're just deciding to invest in it now?
Yeah, there are huge economic opportunities in fast action on climate. You're creating whole new industries, whole new fortunes are going to be made, huge employment opportunities, and everybody now is really starting to understand for the first time that these are, this is going to be the economic story of the next couple of decades, and exciting, and with many more opportunities than we have today, when most fossil fuel business is being propped up by subsidy. They're not companies that are operating well on their own. And which raises the question why we're supporting them. If they're both not making any money and they're really destroying the future of the planet, there's really no argument to continue those subsidies.
I really like that perspective too, because I think a lot of times when people think about going sustainable, it's like from a place of lack. Like, I can't fly, I can't do this. And you're talking about it more from a place of abundance, and that we have an investment in jobs, and also we're more in alignment with nature as a culture, as a society. And I read Paul Hawkins' book, and he said, like, maybe climate change is something that's happening to us as a culture because it's forcing us to be aware of nature. And did you come out of like your research and have any perspective on that?
Yeah, I think I had the exact same revelation, which is, I said I'm a lifelong New Yorker, I'm a child of the 90s, and I really felt like I was living at a time when we had totally defeated nature and living outside of nature. I think one thing that climate change is teaching us is that we will not only be living within nature, but we will be living at its whims. I mean, we're here, we're vulnerable to it wherever it strikes back, and we have engineered a climate system that is going to be quite hostile to us in the near future. But we can also take action to make sure that we're all living more in accordance with that system and living in a more simpatico way with it. And not just can, I think we must. Otherwise, like, we're really going to be in a dark, dark place.
Yeah, that's for sure. And my series is called One Small Step, and it's all about small steps people can take. And I'm curious, in your book, you kind of say, like, that's a little bit of like imaging, like environmental purism, like, oh, cool, you can afford the Tesla or whatever it may be. Is that, I mean, my perspective on that is that, everybody has to feel empowered in their lives. And so if maybe it starts with buying the Tesla, but then it's, lobbying for a good congressman who's going to pass policy. What is your take on the individual actions versus like the larger scale actions?
I think anybody who's mobilized and motivated to take action in their own life to reduce their carbon footprint, that's fantastic, and they should do that. I actually think, for me, it starts from politics. So buying a Tesla is going to cost you a minimum of $35,000. Voting for a presidential candidate who really supports action on climate doesn't cost you anything. So to me, like, politics is an easier ask, but it's also much more consequential, because when you talk about the revolutions that we need, these are things that really can only be achieved through policy. So air travel, for instance, we can fly less. You and I can take fewer flights. I'm taking fewer flights. I'm feeling guilty when I do fly. I probably should be doing less than I am. But we don't need to just reduce our global carbon emissions. We need to zero them out entirely. And to do that, we need to have some kind of air travel that produces no carbon at all. We can't just ask everybody to take 20% fewer flights. We need to make flights totally zero carbon. And that is only going to happen if we invest in electric planes, or develop some kind of carbon neutral fuel. And that's something that can only be achieved through large-scale R&D or regulation and legislation requiring it. Similar with diet. People talk a lot about diet. And if you want to eat less beef to have a smaller carbon footprint, more power to you, really. But there's also small-scale studies showing that if you feed cattle seaweed, their methane emissions fall by 95 or 99%. Which means if we could just require every cattle farmer to feed their cows a little bit of seaweed, we could completely eliminate the carbon footprint of beef entirely, and we wouldn't have to worry about the lifestyle choices of you and me and what we're ordering at the restaurant tonight. And I think that that's really the case wherever you look, that individuals can make a difference in their own lives, and I think that's most important as a way of teaching the world that we can all live responsibly and still live prosperously. But if we're talking about getting to an entire planet system by 2050 where we have no carbon emissions at all, which is what we need, we simply can't do that without policy, which for me means that the most important action, which is also, like I said, the cheapest, is voting and supporting candidates who are really prioritizing this issue. Yeah,
and I think there has been a sea change. Like, we've seen the Green New Deals come out onto the public stage, and I know you've written about what you think about it. What is your perspective on the Green New Deal?
Well, I think it's preliminary. There are huge unanswered questions about exactly how we get to the targets that it lays out. But to me, the Democratic Party 5 years ago considered a cap-and-trade program to be too radical, and this is just
way more.
Way more. It's incredible to see. No, really, it's incredible to see. And the most exciting part of it to me is that they really do build their goals out of the science. So rather than defining their targets through what they consider politically possible, they say, here is what the UN believes is necessary. Now we must develop a policy and a politics to make those targets achievable. And that's a completely different perspective than any American politician was talking about even just a few years ago. And the fact that all of the major presidential candidates have signed on to it in some form or another is amazing. Now we'll see what happens when it actually becomes real legislation, how some of the trade-offs get worked out. like I said, these are a lot of open questions, but just as a statement of principles, to me, it's exhilarating.
And what do you think about the carbon tax? Because I know that that's been floated in years past, like it's a silver bullet, but then you see like the yellow jackets in France and they're protesting because their gas prices are going up. I don't know much about it, but that's the headlines I read.
Yeah.
What do you think that is something that would really help if we had a carbon tax?
If a carbon tax was big enough, it could have an impact.
Yeah.
But the UN says that in order to safely stay below 2 degrees of warming, which is this threshold of a catastrophe, a carbon tax would have to be perhaps as high as $5,500 a ton. And there's nowhere in the world today that has a carbon tax that's 1/100th that level.
Okay.
So we're dealing, what's politically feasible anywhere in the world is so trivial compared to what's necessary. And the scale of a carbon tax that would work, I think, would be so high that it would, practically speaking, effectively be a ban. Now, one of the issues in the French protests, and you see this around the world whenever there's resistance to climate action, is that we hear a lot about the cost of a new policy without hearing about the cost of a trade-off.
Yeah.
So we do a lot of things in the world that are expensive. We provide public education to people. We support a standing military. In many parts of the world, we provide healthcare to people. Those things cost a lot of money, but we understand that it's a more efficient investment than if we let the market do that on its own.
Yeah.
And we think that it's valuable enough to devote that money to those causes. Climate should be talked about in the same way. It's not just a matter of this particular carbon tax or this particular regulation having some dollar figure attached to it. You have to think of it in terms of the cost of inaction. And as I was saying before, the economic opportunities of completely changing our system so that we're creating whole new sectors, whole new industries that are more renewable, more green, more sustainable. And I think once you start to talk about policies in those terms, they'll stop seeming so difficult for the public to swallow. On the particular question of the carbon tax, sorry to circle back.
No, it's okay. I want to know.
The economists who study it say that you often hear about the carbon tax in terms of the cigarette tax, which had a really meaningful impact on how much people are smoking. But the profit margins on cigarettes are so small, and the profit margin on a barrel of oil is like 90%, which means that oil companies could really
be making less. Oh yeah,
they could absorb a lot of the tax without passing it along to the consumer, and that means that it will have a trivial impact on consumption. So my preference is with action that takes other routes, but I think a carbon tax, if it's high enough, could have an impact. I think it's important for all of us to understand the carbon cost of everything that we do, and the carbon tax might be one way of sort of teaching in that way.
Right.
So that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I think we probably will see in our supermarkets alongside food that's labeled
calories and carbon.
Yeah. I do think that's possible.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think we'll see people in the same way that they now pride themselves on eating organic, pride themselves on eating in a more carbon-friendly way.
That's so interesting.
And it'll probably happen at the level of cities too, where you'll see a competition between who's going to ban cars first. And
I wouldn't mind having more walking space in New York.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I mean it's hellish driving around the city. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting. I want to keep talking to you forever, but I know we're getting to the end. So I'm just curious. We have a new season of One Small Step coming out June 8th. Everybody, tune in. I want to know, what would be the one small step that you would give to viewers watching this? What is the one action that they can take in their life that you think would help the climate crisis, keep us from warming any more than we already are?
For me, really, it's just support politicians who are excited about this. That to me, it's both a small ask and the most impactful one. So it's a really appealing answer. If you want to fly less, if you want to eat less meat, if you want to buy an electric car, those things are all good. But to me, what we need is a politics that prioritizes climate as the all-encompassing, all-governing imperative and story of our time, which is what it is.
Amazing. And you guys should all read David's book. It is so good. It's a little scary, but I think it's like getting a diagnosis from a doctor when you're really unhealthy. You're smoking cigarettes your whole life. It's better to and they go you can either stop smoking cigarettes and be healthy and start working out, or your life is going to be this much shorter. So it's we have to know how bad it is so then we can act from that place instead of living in denial. Is that kind of what you were thinking?
Absolutely, yeah.
So I still feel optimistic, even though it's a little scary. And I know this is Earth Day and we want to be out and we want to be hugging trees, but I really feel at this point in time and where we are with the climate, it's so important to just be honest. It's really bad. And we can't live in denial anymore. We have to really take a stand. So thank you so much for being here. I learned so much. Pick up this book and enjoy Earth Day, everybody. We'll see you later. Bye.